Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you very much for those of you sitting here listening to me. I am going to present some of the work that I and my colleagues have done at Aalborg University in Denmark. My focus is not going to be very much on specific scenarios, but it's rather going to be the interrelationship between scenario making, policy making, and how we can transition the entire energy system. I don't know if you can read the small details, but otherwise we've got plenty of seats up front. So as I usually say to my students, you're very welcome to sit up front. Of course, you run the risk of me asking you questions if you sit up front. But I will start by introducing what we have accomplished in Denmark. And secondly, I will introduce how we got there. And then I will focus a little bit about the energy systems modeling and how energy systems modeling is playing a role in the transition that we are actually seeing as we speak. So, to show you some of the key indicators of the Danish energy system development. First of all, we've had a relatively stable energy consumption over the last 40 years. It's been around 800 petajoules all since the 1970s, and that has been one of the effects of a very aggressive, very active energy policy that we've had in Denmark. So, stable electricity consumption also. 50% of the electricity consumption in Denmark comes from a cogeneration of heat and power. I will come back to that in a minute. We have a lot of district heating. More than 55% of the heating demand in Denmark is actually covered by district heating, and this number actually grows by about 1% per year. So this is an effect of people moving into the cities, but also an effect of district heating actually moving to areas currently served by, for instance, natural gas or oil boilers even. Last year, we had 40% of wind power in the Danish energy system, which I do believe is the highest in the world. I can't imagine anywhere else with anything resembling such a number. We also have a lot of offshore wind farms. And when we're talking about offshore wind farms, we are talking about multi-100 megawatt wind farms. We're talking 200, 400, 600 megawatt wind farms. So we're developing that quite aggressively in Denmark, and that, of course, is also one of the reasons why we can reach such a high degree as 40% of wind power. Because even in Denmark, not everybody likes to live next door to a wind turbine. But we do have some shallow waters surrounding the country, so we can go a bit offshore and still have relatively shallow waters, 20, 30 meters, maybe 10, 20 kilometers away from the coast, and that is perfectly good for erecting wind turbines also. If we look at some of the charts, the one in the top right corner, that shows the primary energy consumption and how it has developed. In this transition period, I would say this just shows from 1972 to 2007. And you probably can't see the details, but the blue, that is oil. And if we go back 4 decades, it was almost exclusively oil that was being used in the Danish energy system. And 40 years later, we have a much wider basket of fuels being used in the Danish energy system. So we have made a transformation from a single fuel use to a multitude of different fuel uses. If we look at the bottom, that's for house heating. Not only have we made the transformation from a single use or single fuel use to a multitude of different uses, we also actually have a decreasing trend in spite of more square meters being heated. One of the ways that we've actually managed to push out a lot of oil and introduce, well, in the beginning we started introducing a lot of coal into the system, but that was because by expansion of district heating we could actually move away from individual oil boilers and into coal-fired power plants. Plants like this is a small decentralized CHP plant. We have them in all towns and cities in Denmark. This is even a village with only 200 houses. So it has been a very active policy of finding all the heat demands in Denmark and then establishing district heating networks and establishing CHP plants. If time permits, then I do even have a presentation or a few slides on what policies we actually put in place to advance the development of district heating and CHP in Denmark. If we look at the electricity system, again, 4 decades ago, it was mainly big coal-fired or oil-fired power plants at that point in time. But moving into the 90s, we saw this very large increase in CHP, all these small CHPs, and they reached up to about 30% of the power generation. And these are just the small-scale CHPs, not counting the large scales. Wind power, this graph stops in 2013. Had it taken a few more years, then we would have reached the 40% we have to this year. But we see that the developments, they started relatively early. One way to demonstrate this transition that we have been going through, that is to show a map of how the Danish energy system looked like in 1985 and then look at it 30 years in ahead. You can't see the details, but you will see that there are some red dots on this map, and those are the big power plants. Then we have some small dots, which are wind turbines, and we have some orange dots, like that one there. That is one of the small decentralized CHP plants with district heating. So moving ahead 30 years in time, this is how the system looks like. And to most transmission system operators in the world, this is the worst nightmare that they could envision. Because the wind turbines, as you probably know, they produce when the wind is blowing. The CHP plants, well, they do have some economic incentives to operate wisely, but there's no guarantee that they do it. So 75% they are operating wisely. That is according to what are the prices, but some they are not. I mean, basically, if you own a CHP plant, you can just set it to a timer and then say, okay, turn on, or you can set it to follow the heat demand and not really what is actually demanded from the electricity system. So this is the worst nightmare from a transmission system operator's point of view, but I think it's also been a steep learning curve for the Danish transmission system operator, because they've actually learned that this is, in fact, possible to operate a system like this. I should mention that we do have connections to other countries, so they can also help us maintain the balance in the electricity system. So those were some of the accomplishments, but how did we get there? Well, as I mentioned, we've had this active energy policy and active energy planning for at least 4 decades. It seemed to all start in 1973 when we had the first oil crisis, when the oil price went from about $10 per barrel to about $80, I believe it was, no, $100 per barrel. So this 10 doubling of the oil price, that really had a large impact on a society like the Danish, because we were entirely dependent on imported oil, and even more than most other countries. And since our prime minister at that point, he supported Israel in one of the numerous wars in the Middle East, then there was actually an embargo on Denmark, and the Middle East did not want to export oil to Denmark. So we woke up to this reality that even if we could buy oil, it was very expensive. So starting at this point in time, we had a very aggressive energy policy. So what did we decide to do? Well, we decided to build a nuclear power plant, of course, because that is what you do in a country at this point in time when you want to become independent of oil from the Middle East. However, this was in the 70s, where whatever was going on in society was more about growing organic marijuana and listening to psychedelic music and free sex and whatever. I didn't spend much of my life in those years, but that's what I've heard. And it didn't go very well with the idea of nuclear power plants, because you're associated with reactor accidents and nuclear bombs and everything. So there was very large resistance to that. So one thing I would like to point out, that is this column here, this approach. The politicians, they were presented with one suggestion. The Danish Ministry of Trade, we didn't have a Ministry of Energy at that time, so it was a Ministry of Trade. They made this plan and they say, that is the plan. Take it or take it, basically. Leave it was not an option, so it was take it or take it. I'll actually come back to this take it or take it option in a few slides also. Things progressed. I'm not going into detail with all the different energy plans that we've had, but after this initial take it or take it option, we did actually have more alternatives being presented for the politicians, and gradually we also had more and more renewable energy in the different plans, and nowadays we actually have 100% energy in our energy plans, and we've had that for the last few energy plans. So at the same time as we've had this on the official agenda, or on the political agenda, we've also had interest groups, we've had academia working on this. So for instance, when the very first energy plan came out and it was about nuclear power, my oldest colleague, who's in his 70s now, he was actually part of this draft to an alternative energy plan. So they started this tradition of whenever the government issued official energy plans, then they issued unofficial energy plans, and actually tried to steer the direction of the public debate in some more renewable energy favorable direction. So they came up with this appreciation with a spelling error that you could actually have a non-nuclear power system in Denmark. And later on, we also had this idea of actually presenting alternatives, that you can have not just one choice, take it or take it, but you can have more choices and then you can pick which you find is appropriate based on whatever criteria that you're investigating it from. The outlook or the focus area of these energy plans, they have developed over time, and just to say that nowadays these plans here, this is one from the Danish Society of Engineers, but that's also made by my university, and these other projects here, they have mainly focused on how can we transition to a 100% renewable energy system. A few weeks ago we just got funding for a new project which actually looks at Denmark in the energy system of Northern Europe. So we're not so much focused on Denmark as a standalone system, which these ones to some extent are, but we are looking into Denmark, or we're going to look into Denmark on a more European scale. So we're not optimizing Denmark, but we're trying to optimize Europe. So one of my, or this is the work of two of my colleagues. One doing choice awareness, which he wrote a doctoral thesis on, and he stressed that it is important to have choices in the political decision process, that you're not just being presented with one alternative, that you actually have a choice, a democratic choice between different alternatives. We have true choices and false choices. Well, a false choice, that is a choice that is not really a choice. For instance, if your country is going down the drain and you can't get energy and you are presenting two choices, either we go down the drain or we build nuclear power, then you have a true choice. Well, actually, then you have a false choice, because going down the drain is not really a choice. So you're just being presented with a false choice situation. It's not really a choice situation. Hobson's choice, it's a term in choice theory. He was renting out horses, and people always wanted the best horse. But then at some point he said, you take the horse which is the next in line. It's this horse or no horse. So that was a Hobson's choice. So take it or leave it. Or in this case, take it or take it. Radical technology change. We have to understand that technology is not only about technical infrastructures. It is also about who owns it. It's about the knowledge. It's about the economy, the profit of the system. So everything is intertwined. And of course, when we're changing something in the energy system, when we're going from a fossil fueled power plant to a renewable energy system, then we have to realize we're not just changing the technology, we are also changing who makes profit, Who owns everything? What are the institutions supporting it? So we have to make integrated scenarios where we look into, for instance, everyone with an embedded interest in the current system, they're going to work against any changes naturally. If you own a coal-fired power plant, then you're going to work against anything having to do with curbing the use of coal in the energy system. So we have to make integrated analysis of these different changes in the energy system, and they should happen concurrently. And then, of course, you will have the choice. So should we make it profitable for the coal-fired power plants to actually stop working, or should we disregard it and simply say, tough luck, you've had your time. But it should be a conscious choice, and we should be aware of all these different situations. My last part, and probably also my largest part, that is about the modeling of scenarios and how that can play a role in such a transition process. Actually, we already heard a little bit about the energy plan model from Ursula, so I can cut down my presentation by a few slides. We have 3 phases in the introduction of renewable energy. In the first phase, you are simply feeding in electricity into an otherwise normal thermal-based power plant fossil energy system. So changes at this point will simply reduce a little bit the marginal fuel consumption. As we grow in a level of ambition, we will have the large-scale integration and even the full-scale integration of renewable energy. And at these points, we are also going to have to look into things like, do we have backup capacity? And how do we ensure that we can feed in 40%, 50%, 60% of wind power or PV for that matter into the energy system? Because we need to make changes in the energy system to make such large changes. We've had analysis of Denmark showing that this introduction phase, I mean, we can take up to about 20% of wind power without doing a lot in the energy system. But when you go to the large-scale integration, then we need to look into other measures. At that point, the power plants can simply not regulate enough. So there we need to go more into the heating sector and the transportation sector to ensure that power is integrated well into the energy system. We developed this energy plan model, which Ursula mentioned, at Aalborg University, starting around 2000. And the reason for doing this was that my colleague Henrik Lund, at that point in time, he read the Danish government's energy plan, and he noticed that they had some scenarios showing that as wind power grows, the surplus electricity production grows. And basically, according to the official plans of the Danish government, more or less, whenever you add 1 kilowatt hour of electric production on a wind turbine, then you will simply add something like 0.8 kilowatt hours of excess electricity production, which you need to get rid of. And he thought to himself, well, is that really true? And then he decided to make his own model and try to look into what the government was modeling and see whether he would actually agree on that. This is the situation we have in Denmark today. This is just Western Denmark. We have 2 separate electricity systems. They are connected now, but for historical reasons they are treated separately. The dark green area here, that's wind power over the course of a 1-week period. Then we have the small-scale CHP plants. We have the large-scale CHP plants, and then we have the electricity demand. And you will see that very often in this week here, I must admit it's not a completely random week, we actually have wind power surpassing the entire electricity demand of Western Denmark. It's an area of about 3 million people, so it's not like a small village with 1 wind turbine where this could easily happen, of course. But this is a substantial part of Denmark. And those are some of the issues. I mean, all these peaks, but also like this drop here, that is the reality that our energy system is facing. And we need to have a system which can accommodate for such fluctuations in power supply. And at this point in time, we did not even have very much PV. Now PV is also growing in Denmark, and that adds to this complexity. This was a hurricane, that was another hurricane, but the interesting part was this time in between. I usually say that, well, we name the hurricanes. I don't know whether you have hurricanes in Hungary. Probably not, because you're so far from the ocean. But we do, and they are always named, but I say that in the future, it should also be these ones that we're actually naming. So we can say, Harold took the roof, but do you remember when Karen made us cook in the outside on a bonfire for an entire week because we had no electricity? This shows how the wind share has increased over the years in Western Denmark. This goes up to 2014, where we in Western Denmark had 50% of wind power. And the other graph here shows how many hours per year we had more than 100% wind power in Western Denmark. And here in 2014, that was about 1,000 hours. And again, this is the nightmare of any sane TSO. So, we are looking into alternatives to this, and when you're reading the literature, you see a lot of mentioning of smart grids, electricity storage, etc. But our point of view is that that is a much too narrow approach to this, because smart grids cannot handle this. The flexible electricity demand, or the potential for flexible electricity demand, can never accommodate for such large fluctuations. So, electricity storage, of course, anything can be accomplished with an electricity storage if you simply want to put enough money into your system. But if you can actually, rather than using the electricity storage, which is rather expensive, if you can use thermal storage or even gas storage for some synthetic fuels for the transportation sector, or liquid fuels, again for the transportation sector, then we will have storage capacity, which is a lot cheaper. Notice that the vertical axis here is not linear, it's logarithmic. So the other storages, they are 10-fold or 100-fold cheaper than electricity storage. Of course, producing hot water will not enable you to feed electricity back into the grid. So it's kind of a one-way storage, but it will enable you to defer some loads, and the same for the transportation sector. I mean, you can produce it whenever it's applicable or relevant for the energy system, but of course you cannot feed back. There are losses associated with this, but another key point in our analysis is that whatever we're going to do, the transportation sector and the heating sector is going to be based on electricity to a very large extent in the future. So even though we might have some transformation losses going to these synthetic fuels or going to heat, those are losses that we are going to encounter, whatever. So we will not avoid them. They will be there. So now it's just a matter of having the correct timing and have the correct storage facilities. I'm not saying that electricity storage cannot play a role, but to the extent possible, we should try not to have electricity storage, at least when you're not in a country with hydropower. We don't have hydropower in Denmark. The highest mountain in Denmark is 179 meters. The role of energy system simulation and analysis. So we're going towards a much more complex energy system, and that really calls for tools which can handle this complexity, all the interconnections between the different sectors, the interconnection between the production of liquid fuels for the transportation sector, which might be based on CO2 from a biomass-fired CHP plant, and the unit will also supply district heating into the grid and so on. So we need models, simulation tools which can capture this complexity of the future. So all sectors need to be integrated, and everything, wherever we have some benefit to be harvested, some synergies to be harvested from integrating sectors, we need to do that. And then my little advertisement there, one model which can handle this is the energy plan model. And then let's see how much I have to skip. This is just a little bit about how much is being used. If you just focus on the graphs, you can see it's being used more and more. This is just from the academic literature where I made a review paper a year or two ago. Mainly on country and state level, but also on small scale systems and some European level systems, or this also includes large countries like the US or China, where you have basically corresponding to the European Union. I will skip this because you introduced it verbally. And I'll also skip this because you introduced it. But just to show what are the kind of systems that we're coming towards. It is systems like this where you have all these multiple interconnections, and we've not even drawn all interconnections on this chart here, but it is about a lot of renewable energy. I have colleagues at another university in Denmark there saying that for a Danish system we should have something like 80% of wind power and 20% of PV. That is the optimal combination under Danish circumstances. That of course varies from country to country and availability of fuels, but this is not so much based on the spatial availability, but more based on the temporal distribution of the production. We are going to have heat pumps, we're going to have production of synthetic fuels, we are going to have CO2 taken out of the combustion gases for the production of synthetic fuels. We're going to have cooling processes and district heating processes combined. As I mentioned, 55% of the heating demand in Denmark is nowadays covered by district heating. We don't have much of a cooling demand in Denmark, but it is growing. Also because the building's actually getting better and better. And you can make a building so good that, okay, you save a lot of energy in the wintertime, but it becomes unbearable the rest of the year. And that is what we're trying to do right now, meaning making them unbearable in the summer. We call it passive houses. So I foresee that we're going to have more and more cooling. And of course, cooling and heating, they can be very well integrated, and many Danish district heating companies, they are currently looking into how can we provide cooling also. Because you can do that with an absorption pump in the different houses or in the department stores or office buildings, but you can also have separate district heat or district cooling networks. So complex energy systems are what we are aiming at. And that was what I had planned to introduce you to. Thank you very much.